Oye, 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 espérate y espérame. Pero vamos a hablar inglés.
Carlos, ese no es mi nombre, te voy a dar un cocotazo. Tienes que entender que soy mujer y no muchacho. Me da pique porque para ti soy un fracaso. Me da pique porque para los hombres soy regazo. Me da pique porque transfobio sobrepaso. Me da pique porque ellos son carrasco. Me da pique porque ellos son carrasco. Un carrasco, dale fuetazo. Un carrasco, dale.
¿Qué lo que mi gente? And welcome back to another episode of the Vamos a Hablar Inglés podcast. I'm your host, Reina Taína, and I'm super excited to dive into today's podcast. The episode's titled La Modernidad de Latinoamerica, Los Tres Blanquis. But before we jump right into that, I wanted to remind everyone that Tuesday, November 5th is not only United States Election Day, so make sure you go vote, but also the day of my second album release, Toca Corazón. As the saying goes, when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. This album dives into that very chill, unraveling personal and collective truth. It's a raw exploration of my deepest wounds and the hidden scars of my past, intertwined with the upheavals of a world on edge. This project is a sonic tapestry of my life, pulling real audio from past confrontations with former abusers, capturing the chaos and confusion of a broken home. Through intricate layers of drums, bass, violin, poetry, and vocals, Toca Corazón invites you to ride the highs and lows of my musical and emotional journey. It's a confrontation with pain, a cathartic release, and a call to embrace the fullness of our experiences, however painful they may be. Growing up, I found refuge in the fantastical worlds of anime and film. As a child, I was deeply drawn to Asian culture. Family stories of travels to China, India, and Thailand, combined with family members who were half Asian, shaped my cultural affinities. I spent hours immersed in anime and dreamt of building my own worlds, my own narratives. In high school, I even studied Mandarin, secretly wishing I could learn Japanese to fully engage with my favorite shows without the barrier of subtitles. This album, much like my life, is a blend of influences. The deep family values shared across Dominican and East Asian cultures, the shared pride and heritage, the dramatics of novelas and K-dramas, and the joy of festivals and celebrations. All of these weave through the tracks of Toca Corazón. It's a tribute to the cultures that shaped me and the resilience I've built from them. But this album is also a statement. It's an invitation to feel deeply, to embrace our collective and personal pain, and to move through it with courage. It's about acknowledging the darkness, confronting it head on, and transforming it into something powerful and beautiful. Toca Corazón is my truth, and I hope it resonates with your own. As you listen, remember to take care of yourself. This album touches on heavy themes, and some tracks might trigger intense emotions. Be gentle with yourself. Pause when needed. And know that healing comes through feeling. Let's be brave together. Visit www.larenataina.com/SOS for support and guidance. And visit www.larenataina.com/toca-corazon to learn more about my upcoming album. Alright, now that we got that out the way, let's recap what we learned last episode, shall we, darling? So, episode 1 of the Vamos a Hablar Inglés podcast was titled An Introduction to Afro-Joteria Studies and La Reina Taína. In this podcast episode, we juxtapose my life story and my mother's Orquídeas' life story with the origin story of Afro-Joteria studies. I gave you deeper insights into my past, my traumas, and my relationships. Every decision in our lives opens up a new door, a new road of opportunities. I went over the foundations of Joteria studies, which is the birthplace of Afro-Joteria studies, and I went over the 3 pillars, or better known as the decolonial 3 of Afro-Joteria. Fun fact, I recently was admitted into the Association of Joteria Arts Activism and Scholarship, also known as AHAS, as one of their activism and organizing coordinators. It honestly feels like a dream that I spent the past 3 years nerding out over AHAS, and now I'm a board member. Life really starts falling into place when you choose yourself. Last episode, I gave you a crash course on blanquitud, blanquedad, and blanqueamiento by using former Dominican dictator Trujillo and his policies to better visualize the concepts. Today, I will be dedicating this episode to giving you more tangible examples of the three so that we have a deeper understanding of how they play a role in our system. Since saying blanquitud, blanquedad, blanqueamiento every 5 seconds is a mouthful, I coined the term Los Tres Blanquis as an umbrella term that references all three forms of white supremacy that exist and persist in Latin America and the Caribbean. This podcast episode will be broken down into sections. Sections A, B, and C will be dedicated to dissecting each of Los Tres Blanquis. Section D will discuss the concept of biopolitics. In Section E, I will tell you about the origins of the Latinx identity. In Section F, we will discuss the Négritude Movement, a Black Pan-African movement that most people don't know about and really should. I say it's even more important than the movements in Black America. Négritude birthed all of those other Black movements. Finally, we will close out with key insights, a call to action, and some movie recommendations to take home with you so that you may further expand that beautiful brain of yours, because every brain deserves the space to learn, grow, and improve. Los Tres Blanquis were concepts developed by Bolívar Echeverría and further referenced by scholars like Frantz Fanon, W.E.B. Du Bois, the three Black leaders of the Négritude movement, and Dr. Gisela Carlos Fregoso from Mexico. Let's first focus on how Frantz Fanon and W.E.B. Du Bois played a role in the development and dialogue of Los Tres Blanquis. So yeah, throughout this whole podcast, we're going to be talking about a bunch of different people and a bunch of different concepts. But let's remember that all of these concepts and people go back to this conversation of how white supremacy plays a role in Latin America and the Caribbean. But at the same time, you're going to notice that a lot of the things that I'm pulling from also exist in places like France and different parts of Africa. So it's understanding that, yes, we're talking about specific places, but we can apply these concepts and these methods, right, and these new movements to our personal lives when it comes to this struggle for liberation. I really hope and pray that this dog does not continue barking. Love Midnight, but he needs to chill. Alright, so let's jump into Frantz Fanon. Born in 1925, passed away in 1961, he was a mortician, psychiatrist, and philosopher whose work critically examined the psychological and social impacts of colonialism. His early experiences with racism in both Martinique and France shaped his understanding of the oppressive structures of colonial society. Serving in the Free French forces during World War II, he became acutely aware of the racial contradictions within the French Empire, which influenced his later works. Two of his works that are prominent are the first one, Black Skin, White Masks. It was published in 1952. And this was a foundational text that explored the inferiority complex imposed on Black individuals by colonialism, illustrating how colonized people internalize whiteness as an aspirational ideal, which is blanquedad. Fanon also discusses the psychological effects of this internalization, emphasizing self-alienation among the oppressed, and how colonial structures enforce a hierarchy that privileges whiteness. The second is known as The Wretched of the Earth, which was published 1961. This influential work, Fanon articulates the violent nature of decolonization, arguing that it is a necessary process to dismantle colonial structures that uphold blanquedad. He examines the relationship between colonizers and the colonized, asserting that the fight against colonial oppression must also confront and reject the ideals of whiteness embedded within the colonized identity. So I want us to focus on the second book, the second publication, The Wretched of the Earth. And more specifically, I want us to focus on one specific chapter within the book titled On National Culture. And I pulled 3 quotes from this chapter so that we can have a better understanding of the origins of Los Tres Blanquis and have a deeper understanding of how long this concept of white supremacy has plagued our people, specifically my people, specifically Black and Indigenous people. So the first quote can be found on page 37 of On National Culture, and it starts like this, and I quote, "Colonialism is not satisfied merely with hiding a people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content. By a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. This work of devaluing pre-colonial history takes on a dialectical significance today." End quote. The next quote, "We realize that nothing has been left to chance, and that the total result looked for by colonial domination was indeed to convince the natives that colonialism came to lighten their darkness." End quote. And finally, "The effect consciously sought by colonialism was to drive into the natives' heads the idea that if the settlers were to leave, they would at once fall back into barbarism, degradation, and bestiality." End quote. Now, let's really sit with these three. Let's really understand what they're saying here. They managed to tell the natives that it is their very essence that makes them unhappy, that makes them barbaric. And it's their fault for not evolving like the Westerners did. Moreover, according to the Westerners, that in and of itself needed to be corrected, which is why they came into play. For starters, as a survivor, that just sounds like domestic violence right there. That just sounds like domestic violence right then and there. And I think it's a beautiful example to juxtapose with this because white supremacy is domestic violence. At the end of the day, whether we want to admit it or not, the United States of America is a domestic violence abuser. Whether we want to believe it or not, but guess what? I've been a DV victim. So I've denied it. I've always been like, oh yeah, nah, they're great, this and the third, no, eso no es nada, ta. We've all been there. We've all been there. This is a domestic violence abuser. Because domestic violence abusers say, if you leave me, you're nothing. If you leave me, you're not going to have a house. If you leave me, this is going to happen. If you leave me, your life is going to be shit. That's exactly what domestic violence abusers say. So that is extremely important to juxtapose. Because for people that have a trouble of understanding white supremacy or understanding systemic oppression, domestic violence, sexual violence are perfect examples that are tangible and more localized for folks to understand. Now, let's jump into W.E.B. Du Bois. Born in 1868, passed 1963, he was a prominent African-American sociologist, historian, and civil rights activist born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Coming from a relatively privileged background, he had access to quality education, which was uncommon for many Black Americans of his time. Du Bois' academic journey included attending Fisk University, where he encountered the harsh realities of the Jim Crow South, earning a second bachelor's degree from Harvard University, and becoming the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard in 1895. His studies also took him to the University of Berlin. So 2 fun facts. Fun fact number 1, when W.E.B. Du Bois was admitted to Harvard University, he was actually forced to take the entrance exam twice because they didn't believe that a Black man would get into Harvard. That's 1. And 2, Germany actually has one of the oldest universities in the world and has a record of producing the most composers, musicians, and theologians and philosophers. So yeah, 2 fun facts. As a founding member of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, Du Bois dedicated his life to civil rights advocacy and Pan-African movements, challenging systemic racism and white supremacy in American society. A popular or prominent publication by him is The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. This is very, very important, an extremely groundbreaking book, because here he introduces a concept of double consciousness for folks that study Africana studies, sociology, critical race theory, and folks just in college in general. Like, a lot of us know this conversation of double consciousness. But to go into more detail, describes the internal struggle faced by African Americans as they navigate their dual identities, one rooted in their African heritage and the other shaped by the devaluation of that identity within a prominently white culture. He critiques the societal norms that establish whiteness, or blanquedad, as a standard of beauty, morality, and social acceptability, exposing the ways in which these constructs enforce a racial hierarchy. And then real quick, just a little bit on Dr. Gisela Carlos Fregoso. I honestly wanted to just give her a shout out because she's the reason why I got deeper into the conversation of Los Tres Blanquis. Because she does a lot of her work examining blanquitud, blanquedad, blanqueamiento. So she is a prominent Mexican scholar, feminist, and cultural critic known for her contributions to Latin American cultural studies, particularly regarding race, gender, and identity in Mexico. Her work critically examines blanquitud, or whiteness, and its impact on Mexican society, focusing on how these constructs shape cultural and social dynamics, especially for marginalized communities. So yeah, that's something that I just wanted to share. You can find her on YouTube as well. A lot of her conversations and concepts on blanquitud can be found on her YouTube channel just by searching up her full name. And let's see some other stuff about her. She is currently a doctoral candidate in educational research at the Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico. She also holds a master's degree in promotion and cultural development from the Universidad Autónoma de Coahuila. I'm so bad at these things. Apologies. Additionally, Dr. Fregoso completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Cambridge, where she worked on the project, and I quote, Latin American Anti-Racism in a Post-Racial Age, end quote. And she was doing that from 2017 to 2018. Her research focuses on race, racism, and the politics of whiteness in Mexico and Latin American contexts. So yeah, that's a little bit about her. Definitely search her up. She is very insightful when it comes to the conversation of Los Tres Blanquis. Alright, we back. Sorry. I took a minute because I had to get me a refill of my little bebida aquí, tú sabes. Porque hoy se bebe. Hoy es lunes y yo estoy bebiendo. Ya tú sabes. Okay, let's jump into it. Finally, let's talk about Los Tres Blanquis. We're gonna start with blanquedad because I believe doing it in this order that I want to do it is the best way to conceptualize all of them. So we're gonna do blanquedad, blanquitud, and finally blanqueamiento. Okay? So, con blanquedad. Blanquedad refers to the internalization and idealization of whiteness as a superior social and cultural standard. So what I'm going to do is that we're going to go dive deep into some real world examples of Los Tres Blanquis. So understanding that blanquedad is a state of being white and having whiteness as a normal. So a great example is characters like James Bond, right? That are traditionally played by actors such as Sean Connery and Daniel Craig. They serve as quintessential heroes who essentially reinforce the narratives that whiteness is the default identity in action films. That's something that we typically see. For example, there are a lot of Dominicans that have seen the movie Top Gun and have said that Top Gun was one of the reasons why they came to this country, or it was a movie that influenced them to have American pride, right? To obtain or want to obtain this citizenship, therefore. And what does that say? It's this glorification of these individuals in these films that are white cis straight men. And we also need to understand that when it comes to film and art and media, these are tangible, materialistic ways to normalize a concept, such as white supremacy, such as whiteness. Right? That's why we have conversations of media manipulation, because you can use art to gain a specific advantage. It's like every single time I want to do this, midnight just starts barking. Anyways, we can also find blanquedad in language use. So the dominance of English speakers on global platforms like Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, where content frequently favors English, it marginalizes non-English speaking communities and languages. A great example to apply it in a more Latinx context, Latin artists like Bad Bunny and Rosalia, they've been challenging this narrative by bringing Spanish language music to the forefront of mainstream pop, proving that diverse languages can resonate on a global scale and expand cultural dialogues. And we see that as well with Romeo Santos making bachata, a traditionally Dominican genre of music and dance, on the mainstream internationally. Another example is within film. The film The Help, which centers on the experiences of white characters while narrating the stories of black domestic workers, exemplifies how Hollywood often prioritizes white narratives, overshadowing those of marginalized communities. Similarly, in Latin cinema, films like Coco receives acclaim for their representation of Mexican culture. Yet, they also simplify complex identities, often overlooking the rich, diverse histories of Afro-Mexican communities in favor of a more homogenized cultural narrative. I loved Coco. That film made me cry, period. But at the end of the day, for those that are aware, for those that are a part of the community, for those that grew up with folks that are Mexicano, we understand that it is not a monolith. The same way that Africa is not a monolith. The same way that the Latino identity is not a monolith, right? And just in Mexico, there are so many groups, so many indigenous groups, queer groups, right? We have La Gente de Oaxaca, the Mushi people. We have all types of Afro-Mexicans. We got all types of folks from all different states across Mexico. And yes, obviously there are cultures that across Mexico is celebrated, that we see throughout Coco. But at the end of the day, we cannot forget all these other faiths, religions, and cultures that still to this day is deemed as demonic. Let's remember that. There are a lot of indigenous groups and indigenous cultures in Mexico that are still deemed as demonic by the Catholic Church. So let's really remember that. That yes, Coco is a beautiful example, and it's great that there is a more mainstream understanding of Latinx culture, specifically Mexican culture, but we also need to understand, why is it that we as marginalized communities in America, we eat that up? Why are we oh, thank you, Massa for talking about me? We really need to hear ourselves. Yes, it's beautiful and it's important to have these movies be on the main screen, but let's also remember, what is Disney really doing for the Latinx community? What is Disney doing for Afro-Mexicans? What is Disney and Pixar doing for the Mushi people? You know what I mean? Let's say it for what it is. And that is exactly why blanquedad is such an important topic to be discussing all across pop culture in Latin America. Up next, we have blanquitud. Blanquitud extends blanquedad into a social framework where whiteness is not just idealized, but normalized and enforced. So let's look at some examples of that. Let's look at beauty standards. The dominance of lighter-skinned models in the fashion industry, such as Gigi Hadid and Kendall Jenner, who often grace the covers of high fashion magazines and represent the pinnacle of beauty in advertising campaigns. In Latin pop culture, artists like Shakira, known for her golden locks and fair complexion, often symbolize beauty but also face scrutiny for how their appearance aligns with Eurocentric standards, highlighting the tension between traditional beauty ideals and cultural authenticity. Let's say it for what it is. I love Shakira. It's no shade on Shakira, but it's also understanding the systemic oppression and the systemic conversation, right? For such a long period of my young life, I thought Colombians were white. Fact. And the biggest reason why I thought so was because of Shakira. And yeah, I had a lot of Colombians that I grew up with that they were fairer skinned. Pero también es con Shakira. And, you know, growing up and learning more about the Afro-Colombian community and how prominent they are, it's like, that's another beautiful example of blanquitud, where it's just like there are brown Latinx kids like me that also contributed to this white supremacy by not knowing that there were Afro-Colombians, that there were folks in Colombia that looked and sounded just like me. You know, no one talks enough about the indigenous groups in Colombia. So that's something that's very important to note. For fashion trends, another example, major fashion events like Victoria's Secret fashion show, historically featuring a predominantly white lineup, often sets this unrealistic beauty standard, and it reinforces the idea that whiteness is synonymous with desirability. Another example is in cultural celebrations. Events like Blanco parties or white parties, which are popular in Latin American nightlife, they celebrate an ideal of whiteness and often marginalize individuals with darker skin tones. This further creates an exclusive environment and atmosphere. In another example, we have festivals such as Carnaval in Brazil and Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, where, while rich in cultural heritage, it sometimes commercializes their traditions in ways that prioritize lighter-skinned representations, overshadowing the contributions of Afro-Brazilians and indigenous communities. And that's something that we also really need to talk about, is that how about having this conversation in the United States of America? How is Dia de los Muertos and Carnaval from Brazil, how is that interpreted to the American people? Is it giving credit and paying homage to the Afro-Brazilians, to the Afro-Mexicans, to the indigenous Mexicans, the indigenous Brazilians? We need to ask ourselves these questions. Is Walmart doing that? Is Walmart, during these times of celebration, putting these proceeds to XYZ community? Is McDonald's doing that? Is Apple doing that? Is Google, Amazon doing that? No. It's just this fun, have a good time vibe thing. And it's just like, yes, a lot of our beautiful Latin culture is about fun and vibes, but we also cannot forget who brought in those fun and vibes. It was Black and indigenous people, period. Blanqueamiento. Blanqueamiento refers to the process of whitening through cultural, social, and sometimes even biological means. So let's see that. Here are some examples. For example, in political representation, the presidency of Donald Trump in the United States, marked by controversial policies that often favored the interests of white populations, spotlights systemic racism and immigration issues. And in Latin America, we have leaders like Bolsonaro in Brazil, who has been criticized for his anti-indigenous rhetoric, and Bukele in El Salvador, who promotes a nationalistic agenda, exemplifies similar trends that often marginalize Afro-descendant and indigenous communities. Furthermore, the dominance of Eurocentric narratives in U.S. school curricula, where figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are prioritized, leads to the erasure of critical contributions from leaders of color like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. How about in social media influencing? Influencers like Kim Kardashian, who embody and promote Eurocentric beauty ideals, dominate platforms like Instagram, overshadowing influencers of color and perpetuating narrow definitions of beauty. And not only influencers of color, but disabled influencers, trans influencers, right? Influencers with invisible disabilities, indigenous influencers, femme influencers, so many influencers. Furthermore, we have in the job market, right? Studies indicate that job applicants with quote-unquote white-sounding names, such as Emily and Greg, receive significantly more callbacks than those with quote-unquote ethnic-sounding names, highlighting the systemic biases inherent in hiring practices. So now that we have that deeper understanding, I want to continue to expand on Los Tres Blanquis and apply it in different aspects. So we saw how it impacts our society in different ways, right? Politically, socially, culturally, etc. Now, let's specifically talk about how it impacts bodily autonomy. And that conversation can also be described as biopolitics or disciplinamiento del cuerpo, or discipline of the body. So let's start with disciplinamiento del cuerpo. This refers to the process through which societies regulate and control bodies through norms, practices, and institutions. This discipline manifests in how individuals are taught to conform to societal expectations regarding behavior, appearance, and bodily autonomy. And this conversation of discipline of the body is primarily found in Michael Foucault's work in his book Discipline and Punish, which is a 1995 publication. And this really taps into this conversation of why do we as individuals, why do we feel like our fate is sometimes written for us, right? Or like we don't have any choice or control in our lives, and we're always thinking about it in such a metaphysical type of sense. Disciplinamiento del cuerpo and biopolitics manifests that for us, that answer, makes it tangible for us. In biopolitics, this refers to the strategies and mechanisms through which human life is managed by political power, particularly regarding health, sexuality, and reproduction. It represents a shift in power from sovereign authority to the governance of populations, focusing on the regulation of bodies and the administration of life. So this one becomes a little bit more like legal in a way, like legal, social, like really getting into the nitty-gritty, really talking about sexuality, reproduction, right? Biopolitics, we're definitely seeing that in the United States of America with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, eliminating abortion on a federal level. So just keeping that in mind, we're going to go into more examples of that. So remembering again, a quick recap, it's blanquedad into blanquitud into blanqueamiento. Blanquedad refers to the internalization and idealization of whiteness as a superior social and cultural standard. Blanquitud extends blanquedad into a societal framework where whiteness is not just idealized but normalized and enforced. Heavy on the enforced. This is when it becomes law. Blanqueamiento refers to the process of whitening through cultural, social, and sometimes even biological means. Another example of that in terms of biological means is, having biracial children, or even back then, like more towards the beginning of colonization and of the colonization of Latin America, having policies that favored indigenous women who would have children or bear children with white European men, you know. And another great example of this conversation of blanquedad being systemic is that conversation within fashion, right? Of orange is the new black, or X is the new black, or polka dots is the new black, or this is the new black. That phrase that we see within the fashion industry is also rooted in white supremacy, because we're saying that blackness is only a trend, and that it's this like new thing, and that it's something that can be replaced. This further erases indigenous and African fashion. I argue further that blanquedad is domestic violence, is sexual violence, is gaslighting and manipulation, is Stockholm syndrome, is hegemonic bullying and dominance. Blanquedad is body disciplining. And we're going to dive into more of what that body disciplining looks like in society. It's me saying in the last episode that this was going to be 30 minutes moving forward. Y ya estamos en 38 minutos. Anyways, in the context of Latinx pop culture, Aiza Gonzalez, a Mexican actress, exemplifies how disciplinary norms can pressure Latinx artists to embody a lighter-skinned, Eurocentric aesthetic to achieve success. This reflects a broader cultural narrative where darker-skinned individuals, particularly Afro-Latinas, face challenges in gaining visibility and acceptance. And for folks that don't know, Aiza Gonzalez can be found in telenovelas such as Lola Érase una vez, and also her Hollywood films like Baby Driver and Alita Battle Angel. Another example, in the case of Afro-Brazilians, the Afro-Brazilian population consists of individuals of African descent in Brazil who make up approximately 54% of the population according to the 2010 census. This group has historically faced systemic inequalities, including limited access to healthcare, education, and economic opportunities. During the COVID-19 pandemic, studies revealed that Afro-Brazilians were disproportionately affected, with higher rates of infection and mortality compared to their white counterparts. This situation highlighted how existing biopolitical neglect and health disparities continue to prioritize the needs of white populations, emphasizing the need for equitable healthcare access and policies. So there you have it. That's another example. Healthcare controlling the bodies and the health of people. In the case of Aiza Gonzalez, the Latina body having to be a specific look, a specific way in order to achieve success. Another example, politically speaking, we have Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras, reflecting biopolitical alignments that prioritize certain demographics, specifically talking about the Garifuna people. That's another example where his administration faced accusations of corruption and human rights abuses, particularly in relation to marginalized communities, like the Garifuna people. And another example of the conversation of biopolitics, of disciplinamiento del cuerpo, is in our Latin American telenovela, La Usurpadora, for folks that know La Usurpadora. It is a classic Mexican telenovela, originally aired in 1998, featuring themes of identity and betrayal. The show follows the story of two women, one rich and one poor, who swap lives. Telenovelas like La Usurpadora often portray predominantly white characters, reinforcing a cultural narrative that normalizes whiteness and marginalizes Afro-Latinx identities. This underrepresentation perpetuates stereotypes and fails to adequately showcase the diverse experiences of Afro-Latinx individuals, contributing to a cycle where their stories remain undervalued and less visible in mainstream media And that's a fact because I grew up with telenovelas and, a large majority of them came from Mexico. And anybody that looked like me was the maid of the house. Yeah, that's the truth. And now we're going to jump into Bolívar Echeverría and one of his publications, La Modernidad de lo Barroco, the modernity of the Baroque. And from there, we're going to travel to our conversation of the Négritude Movement. So a little bit about Bolívar Echeverría. He was born 1941 and passed 2010. He was a Ecuadorian philosopher, economist, and cultural critic. He is well known for his concept of blanquitud and his analysis of Latin American modernity, focusing on how colonial legacies continue to shape social and cultural dynamics. He introduced the term blanquitud to describe the desire and pressure to adhere to white Western norms and ideals in Latin America. His works explore how these ideals are intertwined with economic systems and cultural practices. Echeverria's work often revolved around the critique of capitalist modernity and the exploration of alternative cultural and societal models within Latin America. He drew from Marxist theory, the Frankfurt School, and decolonial perspectives to analyze the contradictions and possibilities within Latin American societies. So like I said, the work that we're going to focus on is La Modernidad de lo Barroco. And this was published in 1988, I believe. Let's double check. Yes. No, 1998. This was published in 1998. So, a little bit about the Baroque period. So there were two Baroque periods that we want to focus on here. The first Baroque period was the European Baroque period, and then the Latin American Baroque period. So for folks that don't know Baroque, it relates to or denotes a style of European architecture, music, and art of the 17th and 18th centuries that followed mannerism and is characterized by an ornate detail. So you tend to see a lot of works from Vivaldi, from Bach, Handel, Rubens, folks like that existed in Baroque. And also when you think about Baroque, think of broken. So it was like this, revolution in art, for lack of a better term. So jumping into that, La Modernidad de lo Barroco by Bolívar Echeverría presents a rich and complex exploration of the concept of Barroco or the Baroque as a key element in understanding modernity, with deep implications for concepts like blanquedad, whiteness, blanquitud, whiteliness, and blanqueamiento, whitening, in Latin American and global contexts. The connection between the Baroque ethos and these racialized terms can be understood by examining the cultural and historical implications of how the Baroque was employed in Latin America, particularly as a tool of both resistance and colonial imposition. So there are 4 points that I want us to focus on in this, and through that we're going to have a better understanding of how this conversation of the Latin American Baroque period plays a role in Latin American modernity, Latin American identity, as we know it today. So, number 1, Baroque as modernity's shadow. Echeverría suggests that the Baroque is not just a style or artistic movement, but also a response to the contradictions of modernity itself. The Baroque reflects an exaggerated aestheticization of life, a form of cultural dissimulation, and resistance to the rational, linear progress associated with modern capitalism and colonial imposition. This tension between appearance and reality, central to the Baroque, parallels the dynamics of racialization and identity in Latin America, where blanqueamiento as a social practice sought to reconcile European ideals with the lived realities of racial and cultural diversity. Number 2, Baroque and mestizaje, cultural mixing. The Baroque in Latin America is particularly linked with mestizaje, the mixing of indigenous, African, and European elements. This process of cultural and racial blending, however, was not harmonious. Blanqueamiento, or the deliberate attempt to whiten populations through intermarriage or social policies, aimed to align with European ideals of civilization and beauty, often rejecting the Baroque's embrace of contradiction, plurality, and hybridization. Remember, this is also something that I mentioned in episode 1 when we were talking about Trujillo, where he had policies that favored folks that had children that were lighter skinned. The Baroque, in contrast, can be seen as a form of resistance against this homogenizing impulse, celebrating complexity and multiplicity in identity. Number 3, Baroque and blanquitud, whiteliness. The Baroque ethos, with its focus on masks, performance, and dissimulation, relates to blanquitud, a concept that goes beyond mere skin color to encompass a set of social and cultural privileges associated with being perceived as white. In the Baroque world, identity is fluid and performative, much like how whiteness functions as a flexible social construct. People could quote-unquote perform whiteness by adopting certain behaviors, languages, and cultural norms, much like how the Baroque played with appearances and reality. And this is where you get that birth of blanqueamiento. Number 4, blanqueamiento as colonial imposition. The Spanish colonization of Latin America imposed European standards of race and beauty through policies and cultural practices that encouraged blanqueamiento. Echeverria's discussion of the Baroque explores how colonized peoples engage with these impositions, often adopting Baroque aesthetics to subvert and critique European dominance. The Baroque, with its emphasis on contradiction, mirrors the contradictory nature of blanqueamiento, a process that sought to erase indigenous and African influences while simultaneously relying on these very cultures for labor, culture production, and identity. So there you have it. This conversation of the Latin Baroque period with blanquedad and Latin American modernity. Something that I was reflecting on, this fluidity of racial and national identities across time and space, right? Talking about then and now. These are just different methods of storytelling, where under a colonial oppressive system, hegemonic storytelling persists as the mainstream and only form of storytelling. White storytelling becomes storytelling by default. Legitimacy is given to the storyteller that posits whiteness in a positive light. Because from the beginning of colonization, that was storytelling. Like this white storytelling, this European storytelling became storytelling, period, for the entire planet. And that's something that we need to notice and reflect on. And we reflect on that with the Négritude Movement. The Négritude Movement emerged in the 1930s among French-speaking African and Caribbean intellectuals, including, and I'm sorry if I butcher their names, Aimé Césaire, Leopold Sédar Senghor, and Léon Gontran Damas. 3 individuals. It was a response to the oppressive cultural assimilation policies imposed by French colonialism, which aimed to erase African identity and heritage. The movement sought to reclaim and celebrate Black identity, cultural heritage, and pride, rejecting the colonial ideology of Black inferiority and asserting a distinct and valued Black consciousness. The term Négritude was coined by Césaire in his poem, Cahier d'un retro à un pays natal, published in 1939. I'm sorry, I do not know French, which encapsulates the essence of the movement, recognizing and accepting Black identity, history, and culture. The movement was also inspired by the Harlem Renaissance and sought to establish a sense of solidarity among Black people worldwide. It critiqued Western values and sought to redefine African identity on its own terms, promoting what Senghor called a rendezvous of giving and receiving, or a cultural exchange between African and European traditions that did not diminish the value of either. Unlike political movements like the Black Panther Party or the Young Lords, Négritude did not have a concrete list of demands or a detailed blueprint for ending colonialism. Instead, it functioned primarily as a cultural and intellectual movement aimed at changing perceptions of Black identity and inspiring anti-colonial sentiment. It emphasized literature, poetry, and the arts as tools for cultural resistance and aimed to instill pride and dignity in Black people, countering the pervasive effects of colonial dehumanization. While Négritude did not provide a specific rubric for decolonization, it played a critical role in shaping the ideological foundation for future political movements in Africa and the Caribbean. It influenced a generation of African leaders and intellectuals, contributing to a discourse on self-determination and national identity that would later fuel independence movements across the continent. The movement spread beyond France to the Caribbean, Africa, and other parts of the Francophone world through literary publications, cultural groups, and international conferences. It became particularly influential in African countries like Senegal, where Senghor, as the first president, promoted its ideals in the nation-building process. The movement also inspired the development of similar cultural movements in the Anglophone and Lusophone worlds, such as Pan-Africanism and Afro-Brazilian movements. The principles of Négritude continue to influence contemporary discussions on Black identity and cultural pride. It laid the groundwork for later movements such as the Black Arts Movement in the United States and the Pan-Africanist movement of the 1960s and 1970s. Although criticized for its perceived essentialism and occasional exclusion of gender and class issues, the movement's emphasis on reclaiming African heritage and challenging Western hegemony remains relevant today. There you have it, folks. Los Tres Blanquis. We are at minute 58. I love myself. You know how it is. This is the Caribbean. So anyways, reflecting on our conversation today, right? We learned about Los Tres Blanquis. We talked a little bit about Frantz Fanon and W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. Gisela Carlos Fregoso. We talked about the concepts of disciplinamiento del cuerpo and biopolitics. We talked about the Latinx identity and the Latin Baroque period. And we talked about the Négritude movement. Now, I wanted to give my little 2 cents, my call to action, my little gospel reading, whatever y'all want to call it. So moving forward, disclaimer, the following thoughts and theories were developed by myself, Reina, and have not been scientifically proven yet. Just so folks know. So going back to the chapter of Frantz Fanon on the national culture, specifically page 38, where he talks about the native intellectual. And also page 47, where he talks about this concept of literature of combat, which essentially calls on the whole people to fight for their existence as a nation, using literature, using art. And this is something that we saw through the struggle during the Latin Baroque period in Latin America and the Caribbean. So what I concluded with everything that we talked about today is that what our call to action should be is to create art, to write literature, and to tell stories, personal stories. Because that right there is culture. It's the African Negro culture that was referenced in Frantz Fanon's chapter of On the National Culture. As Latinx people, we can give our mestizajeness a deeper, more decolonial meaning via the communal and collaborative production of art, literature, and storytelling. It is through this that we find a common struggle, or better said, a common culture. New culture built from both pre-colonial past and mestizaje present. When we think about it, these are the foundations of Afrofuturism and Latinx futurism. It is a recreation, the reimagination of a world, a land that was once our ancestors. As colonized modern people, how do we repurpose the land and our common culture as a tool and or strategy for total liberation? Think about it. When you break down the black human all the way down to its quantum level, you find a magic never seen before. A magic suspended, frozen in what seems to be within time and space. On the contrary, it exists in superposition. Now, this is when I get into my little theory about how like black people and trans people are basically quantum. So, in order to get that understood, we need to have a conversation of what is quantum theory and superposition and Schrodinger's cat. So here we go. Quantum theory is the branch of physics that studies the behavior of matter and energy at the smallest scales, like atoms and subatomic particles. Developed in the early 20th century, so it's very new, key concepts began to emerge around 1900 with Max Planck's work on black body radiation, which introduced the idea that energy is quantized, meaning it comes in discrete units called quanta. This theory fundamentally changed our understanding of how the universe works, leading to the development of technologies like lasers and semiconductors. Now, what is superposition? Superposition is a core principle of quantum theory that states that a quantum system can exist in multiple states at once until it is observed or measured. This idea was formalized in the 1920s, particularly through the work of physicist Erwin Schrödinger. For example, an electron can be in multiple locations simultaneously rather than just one specific point. It's only when we measure the electron that it collapses, quote unquote, into one of its possible states. This concept challenges our everyday understanding of reality, as we typically think objects can only be in one place at a time, because we think in binary. Now, Erwin Schrödinger, let's dive into that a little bit deeper. So, Schrödinger's cat is a thought experiment proposed by Erwin Schrödinger in 1935 to illustrate the concept of superposition. In this scenario, a cat is placed in a sealed box with a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, a vial of poison, and a hammer. If the Geiger counter detects radiation, the hammer will break the vial, releasing the poison and killing the cat. Until someone opens the box to check, the cat is considered to be in a superposition of states, both alive and dead at the same time. This paradox highlights the strangeness of quantum mechanics and the role of observation in determining the state of a system. So, how does that play into trans people? Obviously, I'm going to tell you. The concept of superposition in quantum theory can serve as a powerful metaphor for understanding the experiences of trans individuals. Just as quantum particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously until measured or observed, trans people often embody diverse identities and expressions that may not fit neatly into societal norms or binary categories. Number 1, multiplicity of identity. Superposition illustrates that a particle can be in multiple states at once. Similarly, trans individuals may navigate various aspects of their identities that don't conform to traditional gender binaries. This multiplicity allows for a fluid understanding of self, where gender can be expressed as a spectrum rather than a fixed point. Trans identities can encompass a range of experiences from non-binary to genderqueer, challenging the rigid definitions often imposed by society. Number 2, visibility and observation. In quantum mechanics, a particle's state is determined upon observation, which collapses it into one specific outcome. For trans individuals, societal recognition and validation can similarly dictate how their identities are perceived and respected. Until acknowledged, their identities may exist in a state of ambiguity, where they can be misunderstood or misrepresented. The act of quote-unquote coming out or expressing one's identity can be likened to the amount of observation in quantum mechanics, where the potential becomes realized and affirmed. Number 3, challenging norms. Just as quantum particles defy classical expectations, existing in ways that challenge our understanding of reality, Trans individuals challenge societal norms regarding gender and identity. The fluidity and complexity inherent in both quantum systems and trans identities disrupt conventional frameworks, inviting a broader conversation about acceptance and understanding. And finally, number 4, resilience in uncertainty. Superposition embodies the idea of uncertainty and potentiality. Trans individuals often navigate a world filled with uncertainty regarding acceptance, safety, and self-expression. Embracing one's identity, much like existing in a state of superposition, requires resilience in the face of societal pressures and expectations. By drawing these parallels, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity and richness of trans identities, recognizing that just as quantum particles exist beyond simplistic categorizations, so do the experiences and identities of trans individuals. This understanding fosters a more inclusive perspective, acknowledging that both the quantum realm and human identity are filled with possibilities that challenge our conventional ways of thinking. Fantastic. Now that we got that out the way, back to what we were talking about before. So, the white human knew of this unique ability, right? This ability that exists within the quantum level, within the black human. And they sought to destroy it. They managed to destroy the black human form, the black voice, the black body, the black consciousness, the black excellence, black royalty, black sexuality, black gender queerness, black indigeneity, the black mind, the black heart, and even the black spirit. But the only thing the white human was never, ever capable of destroying was the black quantum. You see, the black quantum is the true essence of the colonized people, all colonized people. It is a source of life, not biological life, but rather quantum life. Quantum life materialized within the confines of time and space is better known as imagination. Imagination is the only quantum entity that can be experienced by a black human while still existing in superposition. The catch? It is activated via frequencies. The frequencies of the same hertz, Hz, as the frequencies of the earth, the sun, and the stars. This is where imagination resides. Some people mistake this for the concept of being in a quote-unquote flow state or meditation, or even in an Om state of being. However, it is far more unfathomable than that. Materialistically speaking, imagination can be found in the black human mind and is activated by the black human heart and soul and spirit. When the three vibrate at the same frequency, imagination exists in superposition, ready to take whatever form and content the black host wishes. It's like Erykah Badu said, and I quote, "Art is the absence of fear," end quote. In my opinion, to create art is to create love and light. Black humans are especially akin to these frequencies. Blackness is always going to be tethered to our earth and Mother Nature. No blackness means no life. That is why the Congo is the main topic of discussion and will always be the main topic of discussion, period. White humans were never able to harness the unique abilities of the black quantum, so instead they attempted to replicate their own. Replicating your own black quantum or imagination with the intention of replacing and destroying the source imagination, as mentioned previously, is a poetically draconian, paradoxical act. Furthermore, the white man's argument regarding the devaluation, destruction, and desecration of the source imagination is as similar as a child blaming their elder for tripping over a toy placed on the ground by the child themselves. As the Western saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It is the source imagination ingrained in all black humans today that still ignites the flame of creation and the birth of the quote-unquote African Negro culture, as Frantz Fanon puts it. And when I say source imagination, I'm referring to the black quantum. So, to take it even a step further, right, we can argue that these past 500 years of Los Tres Blanquis are actually the polar opposite of what our society should be founded on. Our society needed to be founded in Black quantum, in imagination. Therefore, instead of quote-unquote whitening our society, we needed to blacken it using imagination. If you are white or non-Black, please do not look at these concepts and think, well, guess I don't have an imagination. That is not what I'm implying by sharing this. We as people must remember what makes us people. It's not our political parties, it's not our nation's status or GDP. What makes us people is the ability to interpret how the world around us makes us feel by using our consciousness, imagination, and community to create art, light, and love. Whiteness isn't a group of people. Whiteness isn't a racial identity. Whiteness is a tool of domination. As discussed throughout this podcast, anybody can exhibit or experience whiteness. It is not just for the fairer skinned. Whiteness, just like gender, is a performance. Whiteness is not part of the building blocks of humanity or nature. Whiteness is the building block of domination, hegemonic power, and hate. Plain and simple. Humans are social beings. We are meant to live as a collective. Let's not forget, we already do live as a collective, as a global collective. We all rely on each other, whether we admit it or not. I challenge all of us to focus on what matters. I challenge all of us to focus on our Black quantum. So some final thoughts. I want to argue that blanquedad can be used as a tool of total liberation. I argue that blanquedad is a war strategy for awakening Afrofuturism and Latinx futurism. What I mean to say is that we know that the only entity or concept that dominated the entire planet these past few centuries was the concept of blanquedad. Fact, with its violence and all. We need to use the entire concept, infrastructure if you will, as a war strategy to break free from the shackles of white supremacy, hegemonic power, and hate. It's going to take an equally relentless infrastructure to dominate global social consciousness. The real estate isn't land anymore. The real estate is the minds of the people of this world. Whoever controls that controls the world. So game on. Now, before I leave everybody, I want to leave folks with something even more tangible to take home with you. Just a couple of films. I want to use film, right, art, as an accessible and easy way for us to have a deeper understanding of the concepts that we learned today with Los Tres Blanquis. So I have 4 films here that I believe do a really great job at having this conversation of how white supremacy plays a role in Latin America and the Caribbean. So number 1 is Roma. You can find this on Netflix, I believe. It's a 2018 film directed by Alfonso Cuarón. And then number 2 is a 2001 film also directed by Alfonso Cuarón titled Y tu mamá también. Number 3 is titled City of God. Came out in 2002, and it was directed by Fernando Meirelles and Katia Lund. And finally, the film The Motorcycle Diaries, which came out in 2004, and it was directed by Walter Salles. So definitely check out these 4 movies and reflect on what you learned today in this podcast. Gracias, mi gente, for listening. Make sure to follow my podcast and turn on that notification button so that you can be the first to listen to my upcoming podcasts. Make sure to also give me a follow on my Instagram at @GamoIsNotDead_ and subscribe to my YouTube channel at Gamo, aka La Reina Taína. In the next episode of the Vamos a Hablar Inglés podcast, we will be having our first guest speaker, Agatha Brooks, from the Dominican Republic. She's an iconic poet and artist and my beloved sister by choice. Stay tuned to learn more about her life story as a Black trans woman, artist, and former sex worker. This is the Vamos a Hablar Inglés podcast. I'm your host, La Reina Taína, and as always, vete con Dios. Y que Dios te da amor, sabiduría y salud. Mwah.
No pasa nada, yo veo agua, meneo